So it was about 3 a.m. and my colleague woke me up saying, John just called the police, telling them that if they're not going to come and read his Facebook post, he's going to kill himself. And I was working as a guide in a private mental health center at the time, and John was a patient who had a psychotic breakdown after a difficult LSD experience. And of course, I jumped out of bed and went to talk to John. And to make a very long story short, 2 hours later, we were in a mental hospital in a room with 2 psychiatrists. And the psychiatrist that received us in the hospital and the senior psychiatrist to which he called in order to assess the patient to see if he needs forced hospitalization. And we sat, me and John, on one side of the table and the 2 psychiatrists on the other. And the senior psychiatrist was asking, so John, why am I here? And John said, because God is guiding me to spread the message of love and to immediately stop the killing of animals. And I want you to read my Facebook post. And the psychiatrist looked at him and he said, I'm not going to read your post. You know why? And John asked why. And he said, in free translation from Hebrew, because it's a compilation of nonsense. And both John and I were like, but you didn't read the post. And John said, but you didn't read it. And then the psychiatrist looked at him and he said, I know, but there is no God. Trust me, I'm a doctor. And I was shocked to see the ease with which this guy disrespected John's belief, especially in the sensitive situation in which he was, which got me to look deeper into this intersection between psychiatry and psychology, and this is what I'm going to be talking about today. And of course, by no means I think that this man represents psychiatry, but we were in Israel, which of course God is not an exotic concept to, so I was thinking like we better look deeper into this. So I'm kind of going to start where Michael ended and to talk about the global mental health crisis. And then we're going to discuss the characteristics of the upcoming paradigm shift, or hopefully the upcoming paradigm shift in psychiatry, the role psychedelic medicine is playing in this paradigm, and the importance of integrating traditional knowledge in order to address the needs of the current global mental health crisis, and finally, the importance of education in bridging the gap between caregivers and the patients. So the term psychiatry literally means the medical treatment of the soul, as it comes from 2 Greek words, psyche for soul and iatry for medical treatment. And already 20 years ago, the World Health Organization wrote that the health professions have largely followed the medical model, which seeks to treat patients by focusing on medicines and surgery, and gives less importance to belief and to faith in healing, in the physician, and in the doctor-patient relationship. This reductionism or mechanistic view of patients as being only a material body is no longer satisfactory. Patients and physicians have begun to realize the value of elements such as faith, hope, and compassion in the healing process. So we are currently in a global mental health crisis, and over 30% of the total rate of disability, of the total burden of disability in both Europe and the US is related to mental health issues. And which is the leading cause of disability worldwide. And in 2014, the World Health Organization estimated that each year 800,000 people commit suicide, which represents a global mortality rate of 1 death every 40 seconds. And they also predicted that this rate will increase to 1 every 20 seconds by 2020, which is, of course, just around the corner. Now, Professor Nicholas Rose, the professor of sociology in the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine here in King's College in the UK, he views the current global mental health crisis as a threefold crisis. And he's saying the first aspect of the crisis is a crisis over diagnostic systems. And one aspect of which is that 80% of prescriptions for psychiatric medications are written by non-psychiatrists with little training and with an average of only 7 minutes to spend per patient. And Alan Francis, the chair of the fourth version of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, he wrote that DSM-5 has created the worst crisis in confidence in psychiatry in 40 years. This should serve as a wake-up call. If primary care doctors will be prescribing most of the psychotropic drugs, they need more training and need to spend more time doing it. It is very easy to give an inaccurate diagnosis, very hard to undo the harms caused. And also, it is claimed that the DSM-5 fell victim of economic interests and power of specific subgroups, as authors are not allowed to cite DSM-5 criteria for a single disorder without paying fees to the American Psychological Association Press. And David Kupfer, the chair of the fifth version of the DSM, says himself, all these limitations in the current diagnostic paradigm suggest that research exclusively focused on refining the DSM-defined syndromes may never be successful in uncovering their underlying etiologies. For that to happen, an as yet unknown paradigm shift may need to occur. And this paradigm shift is what we're going to discuss further today. And according to Rose, although for the last 40 years diagnoses are based on a set of observable symptoms, the approach behind the revision process of the DSM is based on a belief that for each category, identifiable biological markers would eventually be found. And although we know that neurobiological factors are playing a key role in modulating mood and behavior, we do not have any single clinically validated biomarker for any psychiatric disorder, which leads us to the crisis of our explanatory models, at the core of which sits the belief in the neural foundation of mental disorders, which is still today an unproven hypothesis. And finally, the crisis of our therapeutic capacities, where psychiatric medications are the primary mode of intervention today. And just as an example, in 2013, and in England alone, more than 53 million prescriptions for antidepressants were issued, which represents a 6% increase from the previous year, from 2012, and a 92% increase from 2003, which means it was almost doubled in 10 years. And of course, profit-driven pharmaceutical companies are playing a key role in this aspect of the crisis as well. And now we're going to discuss the characteristics of the paradigm shift. Now, an aspect of the global mental health crisis that was not mentioned by Rose is the spiritual dimension of the global mental health crisis. And I believe that the ability of psychiatrists and psychologists to address spiritual needs of their patients will play a key role in the upcoming mental health paradigm. So, in one study, 95% of psychiatric inpatients in a mental hospital in Minnesota declared a strong belief in God. In another study, over 80% felt that their spiritual beliefs had a positive impact on their illness, yet over a third of them did not feel that they were able to discuss spiritual matters with their psychiatrists. And while in general population over 80% have a belief in God or a higher power, around only a third of psychiatrists and psychologists hold such beliefs. Now, in order to address this huge gap between the patients and their caregivers, Raffay, Wood, and Todd suggest here a model that basically adds the spiritual dimension or the spiritual aspect into the current biopsychosocial model. And what they've seen is that when here there's like a big circle saying spiritual, so they've seen that when they fail to respect the spiritual beliefs of their patient, the patient is much less likely to cooperate with the biopsycho and social aspects of the therapeutic model. And they've also shown that when spirituality, like in the model here in the bottom, when spirituality transcends the other dimensions, it is also a better representation of the role spirituality plays in the healing process according to the worldview of research participants. Now, what is spirituality? So, spirituality can be defined as a personal quest for understanding answers to ultimate questions about life, about meaning, and about relationship to the sacred or to a higher power. It can also be defined as the intrinsic capacity for self-transcendence, in which the self is embedded in something greater than the self. Or, put more simply, in the words of Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh, to be spiritual is to be solid, calm, and peaceful, and to be able to look deeply inside and around us. It means having the capacity to handle our afflictions, our anger, cravings, despair, and discrimination. It means being able to see the nature of interbeing between people, nations, races, and all forms of life. Now, the word transpersonal means beyond the personal, which in the context of psychotherapy refers to beyond the usual limits of the ego or the personality. And during the late 60s, Abraham Maslow, the father of humanistic psychology, together with pioneers like Stanislav Grof, Antoni Sutic, Miles Veitch, James Fadiman, and Sonia Margulies, were meeting with the intention to establish a new force in psychology, one that will represent the full spectrum of the human experience. And the results of these meetings was the establishment of transpersonal psychology, which is basically a school of thought that honors the entire spectrum of human experience and recognizes the importance of transcendent states and spiritual experiences for the psychotherapeutic process. Now, unfortunately, very little of the profound insights gained by 50 years of transpersonal research managed to have an impact on mainstream psychiatry. However, Scotton, Chinen, and Battista laid the practical, theoretical, and ethical implications of the synthesis of transpersonal research and psychiatry in the textbook of Transpersonal Psychiatry and Psychology, in which they write, transpersonal psychiatry is a psychiatry that seeks to foster development, correct development arrests, and heal traumas at all levels of development, including transpersonal levels. It extends the standards of biopsychosocial model of psychiatry to biopsychosocial spiritual one, in which the later stages of human development are concerned with development beyond or transcendent of the individual. And another brilliant book about spiritual perspectives in psychiatry is Walking Shadows, written by Tim Reed, a psychiatrist who will also be presenting here in Breaking Convention, where he suggests a biopsychosocio-archetypal model of care. Now, of course, one of the main differences between transpersonal psychologists and psychiatrists is psychopharmacological intervention, which can at times be essential for the healing process of the patient and, of course, can often prevent harm from the patient or his surroundings. But from a transpersonal perspective, psychopharmacological intervention should be minimized at all costs to provide the patient with an appropriate combination of mental stability and agility, with a balanced level of symptoms, and to allow the psychiatrist and the patient to integrate spiritual knowledge and practices with meaningful psychopharmacological intervention. And to conclude this part of the talk, by bringing together modern psychiatry, transpersonal psychology, and ancient as well as modern spiritual practices, we can help create a safe and supportive environment for psychiatric patients and thus greatly contribute to the well-being of both patients and psychiatrists in the emerging paradigm. And of course, psychedelic medicines are coming back to the spotlight of academic research. And I'm going to shortly discuss the role that they play in integrating spirituality into the next paradigm in mental health. So we all know that psychedelics are catalysts of transformation. But something that is not widely known is that even the current biological paradigm in psychiatry was driven by psychedelics, or specifically by the discovery of the structural relationship between LSD and serotonin in 1954. And basically, until that time, this discovery of the structural relationship between LSD and serotonin led to the realization that LSD's mental effects are caused by the interaction with the serotonergic system that was discovered in the brain only 1 year earlier in Harvard by Tuareg and Page. And in the word of David Nichols, the founding president of the Hefter Research Institute, to put things in context, up until that time, mainstream psychiatry had no idea that behavior might arise from neurochemical events in the brain. So this is actually the second paradigm shift in psychiatry catalyzed by psychedelics. Another thing that we know about psychedelics is that they enhance meaning. And as Ido Hartogzon, an Israeli researcher, writes in this MAPS bulletin, between 2/3 to 86% of those who have psychedelic experiences in a supportive therapeutic setting consider them to be either one of the 5 most meaningful and spiritually significant experiences of their lives or the single most meaningful experience. And the healing effects of the mystical experience are another important aspect of psychedelics. And as Roland Griffith and his colleagues in Johns Hopkins University showed, research participants who went through a mystical experience during smoking cessation treatments were not only much more likely to be free of smoking 6 months after the session, but also showed positive changes in behavior, attitude, and values. And I'm saying all of that to emphasize the need for psychiatrists to learn more about these powerful spiritual experiences, to better understand their patients and these powerful medicines that are already transforming the world of mental health today. And while modern psychology has been studying the therapeutic effects of altered states of consciousness since the days of William James in the beginning of the last century, tribal cultures have been using psychedelic plants as sacramental tools for thousands of years. And besides their use of sacramental plants, they've also developed a language with which they can communicate with different tribe members, whether they experience mental crises or not. And I want to give an example from a clinic of a friend of mine who's a psychiatrist who's also devoted to a spiritual practice. And he shared that with some patients, the one who are grounded enough, he can communicate by using the characteristics of the elements, of fire, water, air, and earth. And by using these metaphors, he can establish a common language, that sometimes is much more relevant than using DSM criteria kind of language or medical language. So basically, integrating traditional knowledge into mainstream psychiatry goes way beyond the use of psychedelics, but we are going to focus now on its relevance to psychedelic medicine. So, in order for the emerging paradigm to bring the required transformation to the modern mental health system, we should take into account the lessons that were learned in the past with regard to therapeutic work with psychedelics. And already 30 years ago, Bravo and Grob wrote that if American psychiatry is to embark on a renewed investigation of the potential therapeutic role of psychedelics, lessons of the traditional shamanic healers must be incorporated as an integral component of such future clinical research. And now there are many ways in which we can integrate traditional knowledge into psychiatric medicine. And I think the most basic one would be to first of all integrate values like humbleness, compassion, love, and in a maybe more complicated level, we can establish subspecialties in psychiatry in a similar way that a specific tribe can have different types of shaman, each having his own specialty. I believe that subspecialties in psychiatry can help us better address the current global mental health crisis. Now, set and setting is, of course, another very important part of psychedelic medicine. And set refers to the mindset of the person, his intentions, his expectations, his mood at the time, his personality structure. And setting refers to the environmental and cultural environment, the physical and cultural environment in which the experience takes place. And for the last 5 years, I've been leading a psychedelic harm reduction project in Israel called SafeShore, and I had the privilege to see how a shift in the set and settings, especially in the setting, but also in the set, correlates to a profound shift in the inner experience of the person. And with regard to the traditional setting, which is of course another setting, if we have the therapeutic clinical setting and we have the recreational setting in which I work with SafeShore, of course there's also a very wide spectrum of traditional settings. And about this traditional setting, Bravo and Grobe wrote, for shamans, spirituality and healing are integrated parts of the same activity. Rituals are used to facilitate and structure the experience so that a focus of concentration allows the mind to enter more deeply into the implicit meaning. And this connection with the implicit meaning, as we've seen, is correlated to the beneficial therapeutic effects of psychedelics. And of course, another very important lesson, and maybe the main lesson that we can adopt from traditional cultures into psychiatric medicine, is the lesson or the message of interconnectedness, which is a core aspect of all traditional knowledge and all indigenous cultures around the world, where they view humans as one with the earth. And which is an ecosystem that requires sustainable and mutually nurturing relationship, not only among its parts, but also between the parts and the whole. And this is where the field of eco-psychology can be, is carrying this torch. And in our context, embracing this notion means that in times when both species and natural resources are diminished by the day, it is of no surprise that some of us feel the torments of the earth in a variety of ways. And as Stanley Krippner writes here, healthy functioning needs to include the realization of this interconnectedness and interdependence, an insight that has been an essential part of shamanic traditions for at least 30,000 years. To be psychologically healthy, one must acknowledge that the planet is endangered and make real-world efforts to save it. Now, remember John from the beginning of the talk? So imagine what would have happened if the senior psychiatrist would, first of all, read his post and then tell him that he feels his pain, that he understands his pain. And I'm not talking about telling him that he understands his pain to make him feel better. I'm talking about really feeling his pain. And then maybe, not necessarily, a forced hospitalization would be prevented from him, what eventually happened. And now to the role education can play in this upcoming paradigm shift. So, interesting fact is that today only 25% of PhD programs in clinical psychology include the course in spirituality or religion. Now we're talking about 25% that include a course. Yeah, we can spend obviously years and years and years of training, knowledge, practices, and still know nothing. And Andrew Powell, a psychiatrist of the Royal College of Psychiatrists here in the UK, he proposes integrating spirituality into their training material. And here are some of the major aspects that should be demonstrated. So, awareness of and sensitivity to the spiritual or religious historical development of the patient. Awareness of the difference between spirituality and religion, as well as their interrelatedness. Awareness of the patient's need to find a sense of meaning and purpose in life, his or her personal search for answers to deeper questions concerning birth, life, and death. Also, knowledge of spiritual crises, meditation, prayer, and altered states of consciousness, including near-death experiences. Knowledge of the spiritual significance of anxiety, doubt, guilt, and shame, as well as of the spiritual importance of love, altruism, and forgiveness, and their relation to mental health. Familiarity with issues related to research, for example, the application of quantitative and qualitative research to the field of spirituality and psychiatric practice, as well as the contribution of research to understanding the neurophysiology and efficacy of prayer, meditation, forgiveness, and love. And of course, competence in the recognition of his or her own counter-transference responses to spiritual disclosures. And he concludes, healing begins with the offering of love, a word that doesn't figure nearly enough in the lexicon of psychiatry. Compassionate love, spirituality in action, can only do good and mixes well with all other treatments that may be required. And on that note, I want to honor Claudio Naranjo, who recently passed away after decades of pioneering work in the fields of transpersonal psychology, psychedelic medicine, psychiatry, and gestalt therapy. And what he says about the crisis of education is the education crisis is not one more crisis among the many crises we have, but education is at the center of the problem. The world is in a deep crisis because we don't have an education for conscience. And in conclusion, there are diagnostic, explanatory, therapeutic, and spiritual aspects of the current global mental health crisis. And an integration of transpersonal research and therapy into modern psychiatry will improve patients' and caregivers' well-being. And finally, psychiatrists who want to lead the upcoming psychedelic paradigm will have to acquire knowledge and practices from traditions that have been doing similar work for thousands of years. Thank you very much.